Hello everyone, my name's Heather Neal and I'm the Executive Director of the TrackSAFE Foundation. TrackSAFE is a harm prevention charity established by the Australasian Railway Association and UGL in 2012. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the lands in which we meet. For me here in Canberra, it's the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. From today's webinar, I hope you'll walk away with some new tips for combating fatigue and boosting your own well-being. We'll be having a short Q&A session after the presentation, so please add your questions at any time throughout the presentation into the pane on the right-hand side of your screen. Just to note that today's webinar is being recorded, so we can make it available to people who aren't able to attend today, and we'll be circulating the link for the recorded webinar shortly afterwards. And just a reminder that if any of our discussion today triggers any issues for you, please reach out to a friend, a family member, your medical practitioner, the Employment Assistance Program of your organisation, or of course Lifeline on 13 11 14. Now let me introduce our speaker for today, Heizy Serrels. Heizy is the National Manager for Learning and Wellbeing Culture at the Centre for Corporate Health. Heizy is a registered psychologist and a very experienced workplace coach and trainer. Heizy.
Hi, Heather. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for the lovely introduction. And thank you to you all for carving out some precious time in what is a very busy world at the moment to spend a little bit of time talking through what I believe is a very important topic for all of us. The concept around combating fatigue and how I boost well-being given the circumstances that many of our lives are living under. Is an important one, and one that I'm particularly passionate about. I've been in the space of maintaining well-being within organizational contexts or just life pressures for around about 12 or so years now. I started out working with families and with and children with learning difficulties, and the transition really helped me to identify both sides of the psychological coin and how important it is for us to leverage what we know of psychology to help us be better at combating the pressures that daily life brings us. And of course, in 2021 and certainly through 2022, there's never been more pressures and demands and changes that have impacted us. So in the session that I have with you all today, I'm going to be running through a little bit of a picture of the journey we've been on essentially, and what the impact of that has been on our well-being. Mental fitness is really just like physical fitness. I know that I have to do certain things to invest in my physical fitness. I know that eating Tim Tams, watching Friends reruns is maybe an investment more in psychological health than it is in physical health. I know I have to do certain things, exercise, see my doctor, take medication, do the preventative medicine type stuff. That improves my physical fitness. Mental fitness is exactly the same way. There are behaviors, ways of thinking, habits, things that I do in my daily life that invest in my mental fitness. And then, of course, there are life events, life circumstances that erode away from my mental fitness and require that I put more back in the tank. I'm going to be exploring this with you and provide you with a little bit of a framework around how we combat the fatigue that a lot of that demand, particularly change and uncertainty, tends to leave us with in terms of our brain's well-being equation. So I'm going to do a bit of that, of a guide around that, and then we're going to finish off how I use this to maybe support others. How do I use what I know to be able to support those around me? I would also like to encourage you all that, yes, we will have some Q&A time at the end. However, if you think of that question in the moment, and as I'm talking it through, or you have a comment to make, please just pop it up on the chat. I'm going to be keeping an eye on the Q&A panel and what's coming through there, so that where relevant or appropriate, I'm going to see if I can weave in the answer as we're talking about that particular topic or concept in the moment. Otherwise, feel free, hang back and just and save your question for the end. All right, let me get started with a little bit of a year in review with regards to where we've been and the impact of this on us. For the human brain, going through uncertainty and change is a very difficult experience. Our amygdala particular, which is my stress center, does not like change or transition. These periods are often referred to as liminal periods. A liminal period is essentially when I'm traversing the uncertain terrain of going from the old world to the new world, right? We've all gone through this in some way, shape, or form in our life. We've maybe changed jobs, we've maybe moved overseas, had a child, changed our world in some way where the old has stopped or changed, and I'm now getting accustomed or traversing through and into the new normal. What will be the new stability, the new security, the new way of operating? This liminal period is a period that is really challenging for our brain. It our say is probably not best suited for how our stress centers were designed to operate. I'm going to take us down science lane for a moment. Just bear with me, but I think it's useful to think of it in this way. The reason that this plays out for us is if you visualize your brain as a three-tiered cake. Right? The bottom tier is really all about your reptilian processes, all your automatic functions, the stuff that keeps you alive, essentially. In the middle center, you have our limbic system, and the limbic system is, for lack of a better term, your emotional brain. Your emotion, all your emotional life sits here. Your instincts, your habits, your memories get stored here as well. And right in the center of the emotional brain sits a little nugget that many of us will be familiar with, known as the amygdala. And the amygdala is your stress and threat response center. This is what activates your fight or flight response when something is perceived to be a potential threat to you, either to your life or your way of life. Your threat center activates. Then, of course, the top layer is what we tend to visualize or envisage as our humanity. This is where we plan, make decisions, think through and philosophize, choose who I want to be in any given moment. This part of your brain is it requires quite a lot of fuel to operate, right? But it's the logical part of the brain. Thank you, Emma, for that. I'll see if I can get a little bit closer so my mic doesn't cut in and out. This part of your brain is the logical part. It tends to be a bit slower, and it tends to use quite a lot of fuel to operate. When I make a decision, I require quite a lot of energy, cognitive energy, to use that. My emotional brain, however, is very fuel expedient. It doesn't use much fuel, and it's very quick and instinctive. When my amygdala is switched on, and my amygdala switches on during liminal periods, it activates my entire emotional brain. And it does this because it's wanting to keep me safe. When I'm going through a liminal or a transitionary period, a period of uncertainty where my way of life or the future looks uncertain, my amygdala activates quite automatically and instinctively. Unfortunately, I don't have too much control over that. It's designed to activate in response to this because it's designed to keep me safe. When I'm going through an uncertain period, when I'm going through a liminal period, my amygdala doesn't know if there may be threat around any corner. And so it activates, it turns on, and it stays on in a low hum state of alertness to observe and see, is there threat? This low hum state of alertness activates my entire emotional brain. It gets it switched on a little bit more strongly than it would otherwise. My emotions creep up closer to the surface. And your emotional brain actually has the very luxurious position of being able to hijack your thinking brain. Our emotional brain can do that. It tries to wrestle control from the thinking brain, particularly when your thinking brain is tired. And your thinking brain, of course, has to use energy and fuel to contain the emotional brain's response and the activation of your amygdala. Your amygdala switches on because, hey, the world is uncertain. Hey, there's so much change all the time. Hey, I'm hearing so much that may change what the future looks like. I can't plan for December. I can't plan for November. Your amygdala doesn't like this. Your amygdala switches on. And this means that your thinking brain has to work harder to contain it and to push it back down and keep a lid on it, essentially. The impact of this now, about 18 or so months into quite a significant liminal period that we've all been living under, right? And life hasn't stopped. There's still been the numerous life demands and pressures that activate my amygdala anyway. We've still had all of those, and all of that has been happening under the blanket of this consistent, ongoing, liminal, transitionary, uncertain period, which has activated my amygdala in a very long-term way, which drip, drip, drip has taken up a lot of fuel from my thinking brain. What this has left us with is that for a lot of us, we're somewhere on the continuum of burnout. I might be on this end of the scale where I'm just feeling a little bit of that fatigue, a little bit of that languishing. I might be all the way over here on the other end of the spectrum where I'm burnt out. I have nothing left in the tank. I'm on zero, essentially. And what this feels like, the burnout experience, that deep cognitive fatigue experience, feels like a lot of this that you can see on my screen. I feel tired, even though I've had enough sleep, or I'm not doing that much, but I still feel this deep sense of fatigue or exhaustion. Perhaps I feel a greater distance between my life goals or my purpose, what I want to achieve either in work or in life. Maybe I feel a greater distance from them. Maybe I'm a little bit more resistant to change, even positive change. I might feel that I have a greater resistance to, or I might feel like I have an anxious response to, because my brain is just looking for the certain, for the known. What can I actually hold on to that is familiar? Perhaps my anxiety is higher, my negativity and cynicism certainly tends to creep up as I move further along in the burnout space. Perhaps I'm dealing with memory lapses, foggy brain. Pandemic brain is a real thing. That is your thinking brain feeling tired. Your thinking brain doesn't have the fuel to fire on all cylinders until you get a bit foggy. Your concentration starts to erode because that all sits here in your prefrontal cortex, which requires quite a bit of fuel to operate. I might be dealing with the physical impact of this with headaches and insomnia. And for many of us, our emotions are just closer. As I said, we're wearing them a little bit closer to the surface. We're feeling them a little bit more strongly. Maybe I'm reacting more emotionally to things in a way that I might not have a couple of years ago. And this is one of the places that we find ourselves really here. And I like to discuss this in this way because for many of us, we feel this as a psychological condition, but in fact, it's a biological condition. When I'm dealing with burnout, when I'm dealing with cognitive fatigue, what has essentially happened is I'm losing more fuel from my cognitive brain than what I'm maybe able to put back in, or what I'm actively putting back in. I'm losing more. I've got more sources of loss, more pressure points, more stress, more activation of my amygdala than perhaps the resources I have available to me are allowing me to recover from and to put fuel back in on. And this is essentially what burnout is. It's an imbalance in my well-being equation. I'm losing more than what I'm actually putting back in. And this is what leads us to then what we do in response to this. And for many of us, these symptoms and this experience will be quite familiar. I mean, I hope that it's resonating for some of you on the call. It's certainly something that many people are experiencing to some degree, this sense of that cognitive fatigue, and that my emotional brain just feels like it's trying to take the steering wheel more often than not. There's a lot of uncertainty in our world. And as I said, from a very instinctual place, our brains are not wired to cope with it for the extended period of time that we've been dealing with it. In terms of what we do with this and how we transition from this, one of the very first steps is, of course, to identify what are my early warning signs. How do I take stock? How do I know how much I have in the tank? How do I know when I'm running out of fuel? And this, we get symptoms that look physical. Maybe it's behavioral, maybe it's moods, maybe it's ways of thinking. Maybe I get more black and white in my thinking. I know that for me, I become more emotional about little happy moments than I would have 2 years ago. I don't necessarily rate myself as a particularly emotional person, but I'm finding that I'm feeling more emotional in response to small things, small events, than I would otherwise. And it gives me that flag, it gives me that trigger to say, you know what, I'm probably running a bit flat now. I procrastinate more often when my thinking brain starts to run out of fuel. I start to find myself procrastinating. I'm sitting on things. The centers of decision making sit here. So my ability to make decisions requires fuel. And if I don't have any left, then I might be somebody who sits on my decisions. I hold them. I hang back. Maybe I delay them. I sit on them, which then, of course, my activates unhelpful thoughts. So this particular footprint will look very different from person to person. So taking stock and exploring, what does it look like for me? How do I know what I have left in my tank? It's the very first step. We need to do this first. If I have any hope of really being able to prioritize the behaviors that then put the oxygen mask back on, put the oxygen mask on myself first before I can put it on others. Let me talk you through then how we might go about recovering and resetting from this. You know, we've laid the foundation around where we've been. I've hopefully put some words around the experience that many of us are dealing with, and if not myself, certainly probably many people around us. And how do we deal with this? And it's a really interesting question, and one that has not been very deeply explored. The truth is that for many of us, when we have dealt with burnout or cognitive fatigue in the past, we've usually left the burnout crime scene. That's usually how we solve this, or how we have solved it in the past. We'll leave the burnout crime scene. We'll take that break. We'll change that job. We'll make changes in our world that reduce the drain, so that I'm able to then come back to a place where my resources fuel me up to compensate for what I'm losing on the other end. So it's not a hugely explored area, but as a result of the last 2 years, we've got a lot more research now to indicate, well, what could I do? What's a guide around how I start to manage and support myself and those around me during this phenomena that we're all encountering? And it does take a three-pronged approach, essentially. When we think about how we combat and recover from cognitive fatigue, we need to think about it as a three-step model. And this is the best way for us to manage it at this point. Unfortunately, many of us, we can't leave the burnout crime scene, because the burnout crime scene for many of us has been just the constant global uncertainty that's placed on us, both as a result of organizational change, but also government change, also life change, and how I'm living my world. So we can't necessarily leave the crime scene, right? So what is the guide around here? And I'm going to leave you with this three-step model. I'm going to unpack one strategy under each, but essentially there's lots that sits within each one. For most of us, we tend to stop at number one. Burnout can often be seen or visualized as you driving on the freeway and you're running out of petrol. You're very low on petrol. Maybe you run out completely and you sputter over and you pull over. You pull over on the side of the freeway and you've stopped. You've stopped the drain. You've reduced the drain. You're no longer using petrol anymore. However, you pulling over and onto the side of the freeway does not now naturally put fuel back in the tank. You have to do something to put fuel back in, right? You have to call roadside assistance or walk to the local petrol station, to the closest petrol station. You have to actually do something. There has to be some kind of intervention, put the fuel back in. And this is where steps 2 and 3 come in. But step 1 is important, right? So step 1 is, how do I reduce the drain? Do I know where I'm losing fuel potentially? And do I have maybe the possibility of plugging some of those sources of drain? For some of us, that may be the news cycle. When and how am I engaging with the news, for example? We know that when I listen to the news, whether I'm listening to it intentionally or passively, when it's in the background, my thinking brain is picking up all sorts of cues around the problems with regards to this uncertainty that we're in, and it's starting to try and problem solve it. Whether I can influence it or not, it tries to problem solve the situation that we're in. And problem solving uses fuel. I lose fuel. And when I'm trying to problem solve something that's outside of my circle of influence or control, I lose more fuel than what I'm actually getting back in. When I'm problem solving within my circle of control, I tend to get a little bit back, right? I tend to get a little bit fuel back in as I lose it in the problem solving mechanism. You know, there's also concepts here around boundary setting, around acceptance, around coming back to the present moment, to try and really understand a little bit of where my loss of fuel might be. Do I know, am I good at turning the alerts off on my phone? Is the phone going off a source of significant stress? Does that activate my amygdala response, and hence my thinking brain has to work harder to contain it potentially? Can be a really useful question to ask yourself. Step 2, right? So we stop the drain. Step 2 is, how do I conserve what I have? I might be starting every day with 30% in the tank. I might only have 30, but how do I make that 30 last me the whole day, so that I'm not running at a constant deficit, so that I'm not constantly incrementally losing more and more out of the tank, right? So I start with 30, but I'm ending on -10. And so then the next day I'm starting on 20 now. And incrementally, we're maybe losing more from the tank. We have to get really good at trying to identify, how do I conserve what I have? And the strategies that I need in my toolkit here are strategies that serve me to turn the volume down on my amygdala response. How do I help my amygdala to control its response, try and get in early so that I can contain it, right? I can't do anything about what activates my amygdala. I can do some things to try and control and contain its response. So I'm going to talk to you guys about a few of them here, essentially. And then, of course, the recharge piece is at the third, but certainly a very important component, is, am I putting fuel back in? Do I know? What are the things in my toolkit? What are the things in my life that actually recharge and regenerate my thinking brain? What are the things that put fuel back into my thinking brain? I need that to be firing. I need that to be able to feel like I can move forward and feel motivated towards my goals. So what am I doing to put the fuel back in? What does that look like? This is the more deeper recovery strategies, the deeper habits and behaviors that I might be participating in. I want to unpack one strategy under each of these so that you can walk away with a bit of a guide. But hopefully, just having this mentality around the three is useful. If I can't, right? So if I look at my life, and honestly, I can't reduce anything. I can't reduce any drain. I'm homeschooling. I'm working. I've got, an elderly parent I'm also caring for. I've got a lot. I've got a lot to plug, and I can't plug any of them. I can't change things up in any way. Then that means that I have to be better. I need to be putting more emphasis on steps 2 and step 3. I need to be doing that more effectively. Perhaps I can't do anything about 3. I can't recharge. Heizy, actually, I'm working all the time, and I've got kids all over me, and I don't have deep recovery time. If that's the case, then I need to be maybe taking stock around, well, where's my bar? Am I setting the expectation bar up too high? How do I change boundaries? How do I plug some of the drains potentially? So I'm going to unpack that. This is a great comment. Thanks, Jez. Good time to better understand, discuss the impact of change, old or new condition, especially the uncontrollable aspect of it. Yeah, absolutely. Change is an agent where we might be able to be reminded or reinforced of what matters to me. And also, I quite like it. Obviously, this is my biased opinion, but I quite like change as an opportunity to look in my resilience. What do I have in my wellbeing toolkit? We all have one. All of us have a wellbeing toolkit, a mental fitness toolkit that we've been using our whole life. We may not be intentional or aware of what's in that toolkit. Situations like the one that we find ourselves in prompt us, and they're a good opportunity to open up that toolkit and have a look. What do I have, and what's fit for purpose right now? What have I not been prioritizing or using enough of? It's a really good question to ask of ourselves at this time. Let me unpack then now a few of some of these strategies that I talked through, so you have some practical takeaways from this session. Number one, around reducing the drain. Many of us may have heard of the circle of concern versus the circle of influence. There's a lot that worries us. There are a lot that concerns us in life in general, right? So there's a lot of things that come up that get my thinking brain spinning and firing. And my brain will try and problem solve its way out of those challenges, out of those worries. That's what your thinking brain does. It's a problem solving machine, and it tries to solve the problems that come your way. When your brain is trying to solve a problem that is outside of your circle of influence or control, you lose a lot of fuel. You're just losing it essentially. And this means that you then leave the emotional brain open to take in the steering wheel more so. You become more reactive because that's what your emotional brain does. It's almost like your backup generator to your thinking brain. You leave yourself open to the emotional brain taking the steering wheel. And that's all well and good. However, it's not necessarily the way that we want to be living our life, right? We want to have a sense of choice. Instead, when I'm trying to problem solve something that I have influence over, I tend to create a more proactive cycle. So I'm problem solving, I'm losing fuel. However, the fact that I'm in my circle of influence gives me a sense of reward and dopamine. And dopamine is fuel for your thinking brain. It charges it up. It's the food that gets our thinking brain firing. And it's why we often get quite addictive to sources of dopamine. Our brain seeks it out because it gets it firing. So when we're problem solving in my circle of influence, I'm able to get a better cycle of well-being. I'm balancing out the equation of loss of fuel and and fuel coming back in. We're able to balance that out a little bit. So the question here around the thoughts that we're having and the problem solving energy that we're losing, one of the ways that we might manage some of that loss of fuel is by asking ourselves the question, am I trying to solve problems that sit outside of my circle of influence? And if I am, do I have room to maybe let go of some of them and bring my focus back into what I can influence and what I can control? I had a really great example of this shared with me during the very first lockdown about a year ago, and I just love this example. I had a lovely lady share with me that for her, when she's the mother of 5, quite a few kids by most people's standards in today's day and age. She had a mother of 5, she had lots of children, and for her, she found that as soon as the shelves in the supermarkets were empty, she just went into a spiral of anxiety that she had never experienced before. She was thinking about it all the time. She was checking news feeds. She was going onto the supermarket websites. She was trying to track it at all times. She was keeping her finger on the pulse, and she was losing sleep over it. And she found herself asking the question, hey, what can I control about this? My brain's worried about this. I'm ruminating, I'm holding on to it. What do I actually have control of in this space? I'm not a toilet paper baron. I don't have a toilet paper factory in the backyard. I can't do anything about the access to toilet paper, but I have 5 kids. I know lots of people in my local community. Maybe I can do something with that. And within a few days, she set up a Facebook trade and swap site. She had lots of people signed up quite quickly and early on into that site that she created on Facebook, and that group that she created. And she found that as soon as she focused her energies there, her anxiety symptoms improved almost immediately. She was sleeping better. She was definitely checking the supermarket websites less. She was finding that her brain had let go of some of the more anxious, unhelpful thoughts that she was receiving when she was worried about what she couldn't control. The clincher of the story is that she never actually needed to use the trade and swap page or group that she set up. She was always able to get what she needed in the end, eventually, through the supermarket. And so this really highlights that this is a resilience tool. This is not a problem-solving tool. This tool is to help me navigate the problem, to try and keep my brain in a healthier space while I go through the challenge that I'm going through. This really goes quite nicely and hand in hand with the concept of mindfulness. And there's been quite some really useful studies that have come out of Europe and America through this pandemic, because of course they've been in lockdown for much longer. They've been dealing with things in a far more severe way than we have for much longer extended periods of time. And what's come through in these studies that they've conducted is that our ability to maintain mindfulness is the number one benefit or the number one strategy to somehow navigating this pandemic with some semblance of well-being within it. It's what keeps us sane, essentially. And this is because the human brain thinks it can solve its way out of uncertainty, right? Your amygdala doesn't like it. So your amygdala says, oh, help, thinking brain, switch on. This is really uncomfortable. I don't like this liminal period we're in. I don't like that it's lasting so long. Think us out of it. So your problem solve, your brain switches on and it tries to problem solve something that is very much outside of our control. We can't control a lot of what has to do with this pandemic at the moment. And so as a result, the thing that breaks this cycle is the practice of coming back to the present, the concept behind mindfulness, essentially. My body is here today on the 10th of September. My brain might be trying to solve October. Can I practice bringing my brain back and out of October and back into today, September, this week, this 24 hours potentially? The better I am at doing that, the better I tend to navigate the challenges that uncertain or liminal periods throws up for us as human beings. It's a foundational strategy to maintaining well-being, the ability to come back into the present moment. Where's my body right now? Can my brain be there also? My body right now is having a shower. Can I bring my brain back? My brain might be trying to solve for dinner, might be trying to think through that meeting I had yesterday that was really unpleasant, that difficult phone call I have to make today. Can I help my brain to come back to just the shower? I'm in the shower right now. And practicing mindfulness is helpful with that particular strategy. It's what flexes that muscle in our brain. and in fact, how we gain really useful benefits from in terms of well-being through the practice of coming back into the present moment. In terms of the conserve piece, what are some of the things that work here? And as I said before, your conserve strategies really look at turning the volume down on my amygdala response. What are the things that work to keep the volume down? My amygdala is going to activate, but how do I help it to know when to switch off so that it's working the way it's designed? Your amygdala is designed to operate in short bursts. And for it to do that, it needs to know where the end of that particular burst exists. It relies on bookends, and it relies on externally set cues that send the message that, hey, the battle's ended now. The battle's finished. I'm stopping now. It's time for me to switch to a different way of thinking. And so our brain relies on this. Naturally, the human brain doesn't have stopping cues woven in. We don't have any in there, which is why we're so easily sucked into the endless scroll of social media on news cycles. We don't have an internal stopping clock, essentially. We rely on the external world to set those bookends and to send the message that I'm now stopping, that I'm now switching off. For those of us that might be working from home, this is particularly important. We need to be able to send that message to our amygdala in an external, manifested way. The things that work for us best, this is whether you're working from home or not, right? If you're coming back home from work, how am I actively switching that button off? What am I doing? How am I helping my brain to let go of work, and so that I can transition into the recovery zone of my home? So we need that as a component. We also need very regular intervals of recharge and recovery. A really useful concept to bear in mind here is that when I breathe deeply, when I send my breath from my nose right through to my belly, I'm able to remove 70% of cortisol from my system. And cortisol is your amygdala's alarm bell. That's pretty much how it gets everything up and firing. Your amygdala activates, it senses that there's a threat or a potential threat, or it's activated for too long, it starts to send out lots more cortisol, and it starts to get louder and louder and louder. When you take deep, considered and intentional breaths, you're essentially saying, hey, amygdala, turn the volume down by 70%. It's a really effective strategy for trying to conserve some of the energy that we might have on any given moment. When I use my tools to reduce the volume, I'm helping my thinking brain to not lose so much fuel in trying to keep this in check, right? So I'm really setting up strategies and creating my world to be one that sets up those messages. Your emotional brain, your amygdala particularly, responds really well to smells, to music. There's some really great, very recent research to show that your music speaks directly to your amygdala, essentially. You can use music as a very powerful tool to contain and conserve some of the energy that we have, to control some of the escalation that might occur if I didn't. So this is an important one. In a lockdown world, in a world where we can't travel, where we can't go anywhere, it's still really important for us to bookend our weeks. So there is a rhythm to my week. It's really useful for my brain to know that it's, let's say, Friday night or the night before 2 days off. That night feels different to Tuesday night or the night where I'm working. That I have a rhythm and a pattern to my day and to my week, which helps my emotional brain to know that I'm in recovery and peak, without these external cues. When we're in the groundhog day of lockdown, without booking things or planning things, even if they're stuff that you're going to do at home, a Mexican fiesta, whatever it is, we gain benefit from that. The minute your thinking brain thinks Mexican fiesta on Friday, your emotional brain gets a nice little cue to say, cool, that's a light at the end of the tunnel. I know what I'm working towards. I know that's going to be a bookend there when I'm taking those margarita sips. Right? It's a very helpful strategy to try and contain some of this, and an important conversation to be having when we're living in a world where we have limited options in terms of bookends, and we're maybe not accessing those same external cues we used to have. Let me now talk through recharge, and I'm going to be transitioning over into the role that other humans play for us in our recovery and in our well-being. In terms of the recharge space, this is essentially where you're putting the fuel back in, right? So we talked through the first two. I'm looking around, I'm seeing how I might reduce the drain. Maybe I'm setting boundaries. Maybe I'm helping my thinking brain come back to the present. Maybe I'm lowering the bar, the expectation bar, because maybe I'm thinking that I can drive at 100 kilometers an hour when actually, you know what, right now, I only have enough for 30 kilometers an hour. That's all I have, right? So taking stock around where I'm losing fuel and how I might plug some of that. Then we talk through how I conserve what I do have. I only have 30% in the tank. How do I make that last me so that I can actually make use of that and get through, and I'm not running at a constant deficit or loss of fuel? The third step, and very important one, is how I put fuel back in. What are the strategies that help me to recharge and re-energize? I talked to you guys already about the role that dopamine plays here. Dopamine is food for your thinking brain. It's what gets it fired up and charging. It's what activates it. So anything that provides you with dopamine is going to be a useful source of fuel. Exercise, movement, hobbies, right? Hobbies, if they're pleasurable, if they're enjoyable, if you just like sitting and knitting, the fact that you're knitting towards an end goal, that scarf or whatever it might be, activates your reward center, and that provides you with dopamine, which feeds your thinking brain. If it's pleasurable, it's something that's quite likely going to be regenerating and refueling your thinking brain. We know that there's a real role to play in terms of recharging, and quite often we don't prioritize this. There's a lot of science now with regards to how we manage stress. And the real takeaway from that science is that my performance at work or in life or in dealing with challenges is only as good as my recovery from that performance. I can really only cope with what I am recovering for. And if I'm not recovering, then I'm guaranteed to be running out of fuel. Right? I'm tipping the equation around losing more than what I'm putting back in, leaving me at the potential vulnerable place of burnout, where I might be open to even more mental health concerns or vulnerabilities. My ability to perform and manage the demand on in any given moment in my day is only as good as my ability to prioritize and participate in recharge activities. And look, I know that that's all well and good. I know that it's, in an ideal world, we would all be going out there and having long bushwalks and engaging in great hobbies. And for many of us on the call, we don't have the time. Time is a very rare and precious commodity. We might be juggling so many things right now. We might not have the time for all of this. And I completely acknowledge that. That's a true, very real reality for many of us. And what I will say is that if you have nothing else, you are quite likely still sleeping, right? You might only be sleeping for 4 hours, but you're probably still sleeping. And sleep is how your brain regenerates. It is the way that you get this whole area of your brain to regenerate. Anyone who's had a newborn child in their home, you know what it's like to be all emotional brain for at least 6 weeks, right? You're just emotional brain because you're not getting enough sleep and your thinking brain's not regenerating and not activating as much as it would normally. So if nothing else, if you can only pick one tool in the toolkit to use, my message to you guys would be, do that one thing well. Do it with intention and with self-awareness. If all you have is sleep and you're only going to be getting 5 or 6 hours of it on any given moment, then protect that time with your life, right? Put that lock on the door, get those satin sheets, buy that mattress, do that ritual, have that sleep before bedtime. Make it a technology-free zone. Don't allow any technology in that room. Do what you can to be very intentional about that one tool that you might have left in your toolkit to put fuel back in. We know that when we do this, we gain more benefit from that particular tool or strategy. When I don't get as much benefit. Right, a really good example of this, and one that we are all guilty of at some point in time. Perhaps for me, I find it really comforting to sit on the couch and watch Friends reruns, right? I love it. It makes me feel like home, it's cozy, but I'm watching it while I'm scrolling my phone, or while I'm finishing off work emails potentially. During that time, unfortunately, that's not recharge time. That's distraction time, maybe a bit of entertainment, maybe I'm getting a few good hormones coming in, but it is not deep recharge. If I'm going to be watching Friends reruns and I'm going to be using that as my recharge strategy, I want to be intentional about that. I want to save that space, protect it, prioritize it, set it up so that it works for me, so that I'm maximizing how much fuel I can extract from that particular strategy, because we have limited time potentially, and we want to get more in. I want to get more fuel in than what I'm losing out. And we know that we're all losing more than what we're putting in at the moment. So I'll leave that with you as a consideration. Those are the 3 prongs around how we combat burnout, how we start to recover from it, how we start to be more intentional on it. I'm going to transition now, just in the final few minutes that I've got with you before we open up to questions, is the importance of other humans in my well-being. Harvard University, around about 10 or so years ago, they ran the best study you can find on resilience and well-being. They asked the question, what is it? What's the thing that keeps human beings psychologically well? And they explored 70 years worth of data. They looked at lots of different factors. And the thing that rose all the way to the top, it wasn't exercise, it wasn't going to see your psychologist, it was, how good am I at staying connected to the people that are around me? How good am I at leaning in and engaging and interacting, particularly when I'm dealing with stress? Do I lean in or do I withdraw? And that's what makes a difference in terms of my well-being. It's our number one strategy. Whether you're an introvert or extrovert, your brain is wired to gain benefit from staying connected, particularly during periods of uncertainty, distress, or peak demand. Our brains are wired for it, right? It seeks it out. The neurotransmitters that we get when we engage with other human beings are many. These are just some of the big ones, the big players: oxytocin, serotonin, vasopressin, dopamine. Serotonin, you need that for sleep and to balance out well-being. Vasopressin is the foundation of loyalty and that meaning and purpose. Without engaging with humans, I feel disconnected from my purpose. Dopamine, as you know, food for your thinking brain. Oxytocin is a really important one, and one I'm going to just talk through very briefly. Oxytocin, some of you may know, is often referred to as the cuddle hormone. We get small amounts of it when we eat chocolate, not clinical doses, but we get small amounts of it when we eat chocolate. But oxytocin has 2 roles to play. Oxytocin, when I'm going through a period of challenge, when I have had an experience and it has had a negative, and it has had an emotional response, my memories of that event and the emotions connect up together. I sit with them like this. Oxytocin's role is to come in and remove and take away the emotion from that experience so that I can let go of the emotions that are attached to it. This means that I'm able to move on past that event more quickly. I'm able to move past it and switch on the thinking brain towards my goals and life ambitions, right? So I can let go of what's happened, move on forward. This is what oxytocin does. So it plays that role. We've all had this play out in some way, right? I've gone to see a friend, I had an awful time with my kids, I've turned up in a bad mood. I talked to her about how my kids are the devil, they're demons. She might laugh and say, gosh, but they're really cute. And in that moment, I get the benefit of oxytocin. And all of a sudden, I feel the emotions of that difficult interaction with my children dissipate. My thinking brain comes on, and it might say things like, well, you know what, they share my genes, I guess they're not that bad, or they give good cuddles. And I feel the emotion start to dissipate somewhat. We've all experienced this to some extent. That is oxytocin. It's not just magic. That's the hormone oxytocin doing what it's supposed to do. Oxytocin also has a dual role to play in that it goes into your heart and it physically heals the wear and tear effects of stress. When I'm stressed, my heart beats faster, and that creates wear and tear on my heart over the long term. Oxytocin's role is to come in and heal it so that I'm in a better position to deal with stress again. If without oxytocin, I run the risk of heart damage and having some heart condition later on in life, which is why stress and heart conditions are often connected or have been for many years. When oxytocin comes in, it plays an important role in healing me. and in making it so that I might be more resilient to deal with it again in the future. So we can see that it is a critical and important hormone for us, and asking ourselves the question around how good am I then at connecting in, at leaning in. It doesn't have to be to 100 people. It can be to 1 or 2 people. But do I know how to lean in? Do I have strategies around how I stay connected? Do I, if I already feel connected, do I know how I might reach out and connect to those around me? I really love this top 4 strategies as a bit of a guide. It's a nice, quick way of visualizing how I might go about staying connected and engaging with people around me. The idea of scheduling it in is important. We know that when I'm in loneliness and isolation, that creates a feedback loop that feeds more loneliness and isolation. In short, the more isolated and lonely I feel, the less I want to engage, the less I feel like engaging. For many of us, our tank is empty, right? So we don't feel like doing a lot of this. If I schedule it instead of waiting until I feel like doing it, perhaps I'll just do it and I'll gain the benefit of those hormones, those really important well-being hormones. I like thinking through a bit of a fun and easy way of remembering, throwback Thursdays, Tina's for Tuesday, Monday, Sunday, whatever it is that works for you, but some kind of, again, rhythm to your week and to the way that you interact and engage with those around you, particularly within the world that we're living now, reaching out to somebody else. If there's not much in the tank, right? If having that Zoom call or that FaceTime call just fills you with terror and horror and you're like, I just have no energy for that, I can't do it, then maybe we think outside the box and we look at sharing a challenge. I might not need to talk to anybody about this. If I've decided, you know what, I'm going to declutter my house, but I'm going to do that with Susan. And Susan and I are going to be decluttering one space of our home each week, and we're going to send each other a before and after photo each week. The fact that I'm doing this challenge with Susan makes me feel connected to her. And we know that we gain benefit of some of those connection hormones, those well-being hormones, when I feel that I'm doing something with someone. I might not be physically next to them, and yes, that would be ideal. Next best is that I'm doing it with them. I know that they're in it with me. We're on that same journey. So just to give you guys some ideas around how you might stay connected. And of course, if you're not feeling lonely, if you're like me and all you want is to be a bit more lonely because you've got kids coming out of your ears all the time while you're trying to do work, perhaps you're in a good position to reach out and connect to someone around you. And it's a nice reminder, right? So yesterday was National Are You OK Day, and it might be it's a good little prompt. I know you guys have another prompt in April to just reach out. Of course, we don't want this to be just in one day, but rather the way we live our lives, that we connect, that we look at how we might engage and how we might be open to others engaging with us. Hopefully that's been of help. I can see Heather's jumped back on, which is perfect. We're going to move into the Q&A time, but I do hope that just talking through some of those guides has given you some food for thought, trying to create your own personal imprint around trying to recover from the burnout and the fatigue that many of us are feeling right now so that we can boost our well-being and navigate this challenging period.
Thanks so much, Heizy. And I can see from some of the comments coming in, people have really got a lot from what you've been talking about, and lots of ideas as well. I saw one message coming in saying some of those slides we need to print it off and put it above our computer in terms of recharging during the day and during the evening. Just a couple of questions to get things started. Please send through your questions into the pane. We've got a few minutes to answer those, and yeah, keep the conversation going. So a question just to get started. We talked a lot about individual well-being during your presentation today. Many people are spending much more time with their families than they have in a very long time. And you certainly hear people who've got teenagers really struggling with how do they keep really good family relationships, but how do they look after the well-being of the whole family? Have you got any ideas there?
Really good question. And the experience of the different ages of kids at the moment is very different, right? So, you know, you've got the kindy challenge is a very different one to what the teenage challenge might be. My key takeaway really around this is that what you're feeling is quite likely what your children are feeling as well, that their own tank is quite likely empty. And they are also quite likely in a bit of a spiral around loneliness and isolation, that they've been away from people so long that your body starts to convince you that, you know what, maybe this is the normal. And in fact, we know that it isn't, and our brain still requires those hormones to come through. So I think you can take these same messages apply to everyone. If you're a human being, this same message applies to you. And I quite like this time with all its various challenges, and I can't take any of that away. I unfortunately have no good advice for homeschooling and working from home if that's what you're doing. It's a tough time, and what we can do is we can start to lay foundations around how we recover, how we deal with the challenge and the demand and the juggle of everything we've got going on, and then prioritizing recovering. And sending that message to our kids is important. It's an important one. Trying to help them to identify their on switch versus their off switch. For kids, particularly primary school kids, and even high school age kids, the school environment is completely, it's all entirely based on and off switch, right? Lots of external cues that tell me when I'm concentrating, when I'm not concentrating, when I'm on peak performance, when I'm in my focus, and when I'm now recovering and recharging and chilling out and chatting with friends. Talking that through actively with your kids can be really useful. How are you creating an on-off switch for them in their space? How are they doing that for themselves? Is that something, do they have a rhythm that they're working to? And it might only be for 2 hours, right? Depending on the age of the child. But having these conversations can be really helpful. And it is a chance, you know, to the point that someone made right at the start, it's a chance for us to be able to maybe have conversations around what's in my toolkit, what's keeping me well during this time, and how can I intentionally try and fight against some of the downward spiral that many of us can feel when we're dealing with burnout.
Thanks very much for those ideas. What about some thoughts for managers, some suggestions for managers who are managing a team that have got people in it whose tank's a bit low right now?
Yeah, really good point. You know, if you're leading a team at the moment, I quite like making sure that this is part of the agenda as well, in much the same way you would in a family. But asking your team that question around, hey, what's your biggest wellbeing challenge right now? What's the thing that's pushing your wellbeing buttons today? Or if nothing else, you sharing how you switch off at the end of the day. You know, this is what's helping me to switch off. There's a lot going on right now. There's a lot of uncertainty. This is helping me to switch off. Let's go around the room as a team and let's share with each other how we all switch off. What's the thing that works for us? How do we prioritize and protect our recovery time? How are we all doing that? Let's help each other to stay committed to that and to prioritize it. And when we discuss it openly in that way, we reset the intention, and we also as leaders give permission for people to do that, right? We give permission for individuals to conserve what they have by putting in place their bookends and wellbeing strategies. There's some great questions.
So how do you see the light at the end of the tunnel when we don't know when that date is, or indeed if the goalposts keep on moving?
Yes, which they do. It's an interesting one, and a question that I've been asked many times before around, you know, our brains are very much in the habit of looking forward. They like to go into the future, to plan, to prepare, to think things through. What I would say to that is that it's probably still helpful to keep hope around the future. But what tends to work better is for us to come back to, well, what's immediately in front of me right now? And that can be a way to compensate for the fact that that light at the end of the tunnel is ever shifting, ever changing. Looks like it might be close, then it gets pushed out again. That idea around, it's almost an underlying belief that, you know what, this won't last forever. But then I bring myself back to, well, what can I control? And I can control today, maybe the rest of this week. That's what's within our control. And having that conversation for yourself personally, but also part of a team, can be really powerful during this time. And creating your own light at the end of the tunnel, and that's important. That's the bookend. Creating your own light at the end of each tunnel within this liminal period, right? So that might be the weekend for you. That might be that small moment of joy that you give yourself in that bubble bath with that glass of wine, but you do it intentionally, you book it out, and you prioritize that time. You're creating lots of little tiny micro lights at the end of the tunnel, which make it not easy, but easier to traverse the huge tunnel we're all in at the moment.
You spoke a little bit about the importance of sleep to help with that recovery and recharging the tank. You'd hear a lot of people having trouble with sleep during this time, or getting into really poor habits like taking phones and things like that into the bedroom. Can you talk a little bit about how do you improve sleep, and hopefully these are habits that we can take forth once we're in a much more free environment?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, sleep is a funny one. Whilst we do have quite instinctual rhythms around sleep, we in our current society, we learn or unlearn sleep. And many of us learn poor behaviors around sleep, which impact our sleep. For a lot of us, the older we get, the easier it is for me to fall asleep on the couch than for me to fall asleep on the bed, right? So over time, what happens is every time I'm on the couch, I'm relaxing. So your brain sees the couch and it thinks, this is where we relax, this is downtime. Over time, your brain sees the bed and it thinks, oh, this is where I worry about what's going on. This is where I check my emails. This is where I plan tomorrow. This is where I might think about how my kids are coping or not coping with what's going on. This is where I worry. And because of this wiring that occurs quite subtly and incrementally over time, we get to a point where we might be struggling with sleep for a number of different reasons. Quite likely it's the habits that we've built around our bedroom. So there's lots of small things that we can start to do with this. Number one, the number one strategy I like to share is remove technology from your bedroom if you can. At the very least, create some kind of rule that stops you from checking your phone while you're in bed. You might still need it as an alarm bell, but you get up or you sit up on the bed with your legs out of the bed when you're checking the email early first thing in the morning to do the news feed. Around about 70% of us Australians check our phone in bed in some way, shape, or form. This is unhelpful because your phone activates your amygdala centers, which is the opposite of sleep. When my amygdala is on, it turns my sleep centers off. There's no way I'm sleeping, I'm fighting a bear. So when we start to change some of this behavior, it can be helpful. Creating a ritual that prepares the brain for sleep can also be helpful, whether that be massage, moisturizing, a cup of tea, lights down and low for at least an hour before sleep. All of these tips, you can find this all on if you just Google it. At the moment, Netflix has a really great series on sleep. It's called Sleep by Headspace. It's really wonderful. It's full of really great research. I would encourage you guys to watch it. And it's the science and then a nice little mindfulness exercise for sleep.
Thanks, Heizy. I think we'd be able to keep on talking for ages, but our time is coming to a close. So on behalf of everybody on the line today, I'd really like to thank you for explaining the process our brain goes through and the sorts of things that we can be doing to improve our well-being and to combat fatigue, particularly at this very difficult time. So just a reminder that the webinar is being recorded and will be available in a short while for you to share with others, or if you want to listen back on some of the information that Heizy's given us today. And also just a reminder that TrackSAFE has a self-help app that is for free for download from Google Play or the Apple Store. Railres, it's a resilience app. It's got some really simple exercises to do to help you manage the stresses of every day. We relaunched it in around Safety Week after doing a few upgrades to hopefully remove some bugs that were there in the past. But if you do still identify anything, please do let us know. But I do encourage you to give Railres a go, even if ordinarily you're not a mobile app person. You will receive a short survey after the webinar today. We really do appreciate your feedback. It helps give us ideas of what is useful for you for us to deliver in the future. I'll of course see you at our next webinar, and ARA has a whole series of webinars coming up over the next few months that's available via their website. I really appreciate you all joining us, and I hope that you're able to put at least one of the things that Heizy has talked to us about today into practice today. Thank you everybody, and good afternoon.
Thank you everyone.
Bye.